Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here as people continue to come in. It is wonderful to have you here. My name is Mike Kinman. I'm the rector here at All Saints Church. My pronouns are he, him. Welcome to our Rector's Forum. If you're new here this morning, we'd love to learn more about you and have you learn more about All Saints Church. We have sign-up sheets, green contact sheets near both doors. Please just take a moment to give us your contact information and we can be in touch with you and in conversation. The restrooms are just around the corner here and then to the right, and then the exits are there and there. And want to welcome everyone who's streaming with us. Everybody turn and wave to the camera and Keith over there. Great to have you here with us wherever you may be. Incredibly grateful for the generous support that you all give to the mission and ministry of All Saints Church. There's still time to make an Easter gift to All Saints Church, to turn in a 2019 pledge. And if you're watching online, just hit the donate button right underneath where I am, where my face is right now. It's right here. Just click that and it can take you to a pledge form or a way to make a special gift to All Saints Church. So thank you, everyone. At all times, we put our faith into action at All Saints Church, and each week we pick one way to focus that action out in the world. This week we're joining with Bread for the World in their ongoing campaign against world hunger and malnutrition, and we are writing our senators and representatives and asking them to increase our national investment and commitment to nutrition programs all over the world. So there is an action table right here. Please, after the forum, make your way to the action table before you leave and sign on to these really important letters. I've been looking forward to this forum for quite a while. We were really blessed a while ago to have just a fantastic exhibit at the Huntington Library about the work of Octavia Butler. And I have to admit, before that exhibit, I had no idea who Octavia Butler is. And since then, I have been reading Parable of the Sower and some other works, and I have just been blown away. And we have with us Dr. Ayana Jamieson, who founded the Octavia Butler Legacy Network. And I've gone to her Patreon page, and I'm going to give you that website later. It's a place where you can donate to this network and this work, and we'll also post it on the website. And I'm sure going to make a gift to this. And I found this quote from Dr. Jamieson. During my doctoral research, I discovered that Butler's grave was close to Pasadena, California, where she grew up and lived for most of her life. I went to the cemetery and found it was very unkempt. In fact, the headstone was hidden. It turned out to be misplaced because of an error at the cemetery grounds. Butler's legacy was disappearing. Like Zora Neale Hurston, Octavia E. Butler was in an unmarked grave for nearly 8 years when the error was discovered. How can we build community around her legacy? What else needs to be discovered? It says Butler's impact can't be overstated. She is more than a writer who passed away suddenly in 2006. And then someone else, Moya Bailey, says, Butler's worlds hold so much possibility. Her work is super queer and gender fluid, and there are black and brown people at the center. That type of diversity is rare, and it speaks to readers. Her attention to her craft is something that can't be denied. This is an extraordinary author and artist who came right here from Pasadena, and I'm so grateful for the work of Dr. Jamieson in keeping that legacy alive, and I'm grateful that she has come here to share pieces of it with us. So I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to welcome to you Dr. Ayana Jamieson.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here. This will be the first time that I am speaking in this kind of forum, but I want to make sure that our conversation is interactive. And I don't know if someone has, I probably have them in my work bag, but sticky notes, or if you have something to write with, or if you think of a question when I'm talking, don't be afraid to put your hand up. Somebody will bring you a mic, and I don't mind being interrupted. I'm a parent and a university professor, so it's par for the course. I'm also a trained performer, and so although I'm nervous because this is new and I'm excited and I'm very passionate about talking about these things, I make it look easy. So I just want to encourage you to speak up and let me know what you're thinking or what you would like to hear, or write down your questions and have someone bring them up so that I can tailor my talk to what your interests are, okay? So I really would love to do that. So I want to start with showing a short video that was created by TED Education. They contacted Dr. Moya Bailey and I and asked us if we would put together a lesson. So if any of you are teachers, or if you have a book club, or if you want to know more about Octavia, we actually wrote discussion questions and other materials that you can use on your own. But the video will give you a primer about who she was, because I don't think I need to cover that ground, because that's in a million interviews I've already done. What I want to talk about today is how I came to this work and how it is a combination of psychology and speculative fiction. My doctoral degree is in depth psychology, and I'm going to tell you more about that, but I think I don't get the opportunity to bring those things together in my teaching work necessarily, or in my academic publications, but for the purposes of, I think, following the mission of All Saints and the social justice work that is done here, it's important to sort of bridge those gaps and talk about how healing and transformation appear in Octavia E. Butler's work in community, not as individuals, not in the therapy room, but in community with people. And I think that's what is on my heart to share with you today. So let me show you the TED Ed video that will let you know who she is. And this video, we worked on it in secret, and it was premiered the day after what would have been, I believe, 11 years after her passing. So February 25th, 2019. So this is pretty much hot off the press too.
Following a devastating nuclear war, Lilith Iyapo awakens after 250 years of stasis to find herself surrounded by a group of aliens called the Oankali. These highly evolved beings want to trade DNA by breeding with humans so that each species' genes can diversify and fortify the other. The only alternative they offer is sterilization of the entire human race. Should humanity take the leap into the biological unknown, or hold on to its identity and perish? Questions like this haunt Octavia Butler's Dawn, the first in her trilogy, Lilith's Brood. A visionary storyteller who upended science fiction, Butler built stunning worlds throughout her work and explored dilemmas that keep us awake at night. Born in 1947, Butler grew up shy and introverted in Pasadena, California. She dreamt up stories from an early age and was soon scribbling these scenarios on paper. At 12, she begged her mother for a typewriter after enduring a campy science fiction film called Devil Girl from Mars. Unimpressed with what she saw, Butler knew she could tell a better story. Much science fiction features white male heroes who blast aliens or become saviors of brown people. Butler wanted to write diverse characters for diverse audiences. She brought nuance and depth to the representation of their experiences. For Butler, imagination was not only for planting the seeds of science fiction, but also a strategy for surviving an unjust world on one's own terms. Her work often takes troubling features of the world, such as discrimination on the basis of race, gender, class, or ability, and invites the reader to contemplate them in new contexts. One of her most beloved novels, The Parable of the Sower, follows this pattern. It tells the story of Lauren Oya Olamina as she makes her way through a near-future California ruined by corporate greed, inequality, and environmental destruction. As she struggles with hyper-empathy, or a condition in the novel that causes her to feel others' pain, and less often their pleasure, Lauren embarks on a quest with a group of refugees to find a place to thrive. There, they seek to live in accordance with Lauren's found religion, Earthseed, which is based on the principle that humans must adapt to an ever-changing world. Lauren's quest had roots in a real-life event, California Prop 187, which attempted to deny undocumented immigrants fundamental human rights before it was deemed unconstitutional. Butler frequently incorporated contemporary news into her writing. In her 1998 sequel to The Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, she wrote of a presidential candidate who controls Americans with virtual reality and shock collars. His slogan, "Make America Great Again." While people have noted her prescience, Butler was also interested in re-examining history. For instance, Kindred tells a story of a woman who is repeatedly pulled back in time to the Maryland plantation of her ancestors. Early on, she learns that her mission is to save the life of the white man who will rape her great-grandmother. If she doesn't save him, she herself will cease to exist. This grim dilemma forces Dana to confront the ongoing trauma of slavery and sexual violence against Black women. With her stories of women founding new societies, time travelers overcoming historical strife, and interspecies bonding, Butler had a profound influence on the growing popularity of Afrofuturism. That's a cultural movement where Black writers and artists who are inspired by the past, present, and future produce works that incorporate magic, history, technology, and much more. As Lauren comes to learn in Parable of the Sower, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. Check out this playlist to keep learning about other visionary authors.
All right, so I am a classically trained actress, like Shakespeare, Greek, standard British dialect, so I resent microphones because it makes me feel as though I'm betraying my training. However, we're gonna turn the projector off and I'm going to just get started. So does anybody have any questions about what we just watched? Your shock is the same as mine when reading about the things that she observed around her and put into her fiction. And I will let you know the story of how it came to be that I became obsessed with Octavia Butler. So in the 1980s, she wrote a piece for Essence magazine. It was supposed to be an autobiographical sketch, and they called it, in essence, Birth of a Writer. But for Octavia Butler, she always wanted it to be called Positive Obsession. So she explained what positive obsession was, and if you want to read it for yourself, you can find not an e-version of that, but you can look in the collection called Bloodchild and Other Stories. This autobiographical essay appears there. And what she says positive obsession is it's something that drives you, like your calling, something that drives you so much that you're obsessed with it and you cannot stop. For Octavia Butler, writing science fiction was her positive obsession, and in turn, my positive obsession is Octavia Butler. So it's hard for me not to evangelize, and sometimes I see people's eyes glazing over because they think that science fiction or speculative fiction means Star Wars and Star Trek. It is, but really those are space operas, right? Or they're like Westerns, where you have the good guys in the spaceship and the other questionable guys in the spaceship, and they're standing in the middle of town with the stars around them shooting lasers at each other instead of pistols, right? So that's a lot of what you see, and that's not really what speculative fiction is. So speculative fiction is based on three main tenets, right? So most of the stories that you find in the genre are answering one of these three things. What if only, and if this goes on. Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, those are if this goes on stories. When I work with young readers, I ask them to consider some things that they can finish the sentence, if this goes on, right? How do we extrapolate into the future and figure out where we might be if things keep going the way that they are going? And this is the question we ask when we think about children starving, being separated from their parents, mass incarceration, illiteracy, any number of issues, infant mortality, any of those issues. If we take anything that incites us and think, if this goes on, what alternate story could we tell, right? It's not all doom and gloom. So it seems that way sometimes. So that's speculative fiction. And underneath the genre of speculative fiction, you have mythology, folklore, superheroes, not just space opera, comic books, alternate history, alternate future, and those kinds of things. The most popular television shows are works of speculative fiction. How many people have watched The Handmaid's Tale that they're doing? June's husband, Luke, his last name is a Nigerian name, I believe, and it is the name of a character from Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. So they're very, very much aware of Butler's work. And Butler actually has some notes in the archives about how when she read The Handmaid's Tale, she thought that the character, Offred, lacks agency, and she had kind of a sharp critique for Margaret Atwood around those issues of what she did to her and how she put her in that position as a person who was being acted upon rather than someone who's an actor. So here's the thing. My degree is in depth psychology. I said I have an undergrad in theater from Cal Poly Pomona. I grew up partially in Pasadena and Altadena because my folks were divorced. My stepmom had a hair salon on Mariposa. So I would spend my Saturdays there sweeping up, answering the phone, and I used to go to work with her when she was at May Company. My father was an immigrant from the island of Jamaica. My mother's African American. So I've had an interesting sort of dual existence, like existing in more than one culture and more than one place at a time. My master's degree and my PhD are in depth psychology. I went to this school called Pacifica Graduate Institute, and it is in Santa Barbara. One campus used to be a Jesuit monastery, and we were sleeping in the monks' quarters when we would go there for residential classes, and the other campus used to be the Fleischmann Estate. So I would substitute teach, drive up for the classes that I had for 3 days along the coast where actually Parable of the Sower takes place, and I was really distraught because I was experiencing my students experiencing trauma. I taught primarily middle school, folks that are in transition, poor students, students of color, and students in schools where I had been a student. So I would be, in the classroom, and someone would come in, and they'd be like, "You guys can't be in here without the teacher." So I'd be like, "I'm right here. I'm not in 7th grade. I'm a grown-up." So this happens to me sometimes on college campuses. I go into an office and I say, "I'd like to submit a grade change," and they're like, "Only the instructor can do that," and I'm like, I am the instructor. So it's an interesting place for me to be. And while I was in graduate school studying psychology and the origins of psychology, the thing that healed my heart was reading Octavia Butler. And I was really devastated when things happened. The video referred to Prop 187, which would have denied undocumented students any kind of benefits. Public school, health care, emergency room care, cash aid, food stamps, talking about world hunger, anything. So Octavia heard this and thought like, oh, we really want a bunch of illiterate and sick people running around the world, like what's gonna happen if we have that? And then she wrote Parable of the Sower. When I was teaching middle school during grad school as a long-term professional substitute teacher, there was another proposition that was, or an HR resolution similar to 187, where students were walking out of class protesting this resolution that would harm undocumented students. While I was a teacher, there was a student named Anthony Soltero who committed suicide after one of these walkouts. And so when I was teaching, I would see students come to class with a t-shirt with his face on it, and it was just extremely heartbreaking for me. I had students in foster care where they would be, let's say I had 3 students that all lived in the same foster home, and I didn't know they were all in the same foster home until parent-teacher conferences. And then I was like, why? How could I have served these students better had I known what some of their circumstances were? And it was really extremely heartbreaking for me. And I had this friend named Mike Fisher who would say, like, Ayana, you need to read this book called Parable of the Sower because you remind me of this character, Lauren Oya Olamina, who has hyperempathy. And I was like, yeah, whatever, you know. And I had a close friend who said, you know, when I was a journalist, I went to Octavia Butler's house and interviewed her. And I was like, yeah, I'm busy, you know, I gotta write papers. When in fact, I stumbled on an interview of hers in this collection called Dark Matter. There are 2 anthologies called Dark Matter, edited by Cherie R. Thomas. And there's a short story called The Evening, the Morning, and the Night, and that's the first story of hers that I read. And then I read Parable of the Sower. And then I had kind of a traumatic rupture, thinking like, whoo, maybe I do have hyperempathy syndrome, because most teachers are not crying in their classrooms because their student's brother got gunned down or whatever. It was very traumatic. So reading her work is what healed me. Now here's something that people don't know, and I feel that I should say it, and this is the perfect place to say it. When Freud and Jung and all of those, Winnicott and all those early psychiatrists and psychologists were doing their work, most of what Western psychology of diagnosis and psychoanalysis is based on mistranslations of Freud's work. Here's the kicker. When they translated the word Seele, S-E-E-L-E, I don't speak German, French is my chosen foreign language, and Spanish because I grew up in the IE, but they translated that word as mental apparatus, mind, and mental process, or something like that. You all know what that word was supposed to be. Soul. Pacifica Graduate Institute's motto is for the sake of tending the soul in and of the world. I'm gonna give you guys I'll give it to you in the Latin, I suppose, and the translation. So when I was in school, working with these students and figuring out how to deal with trauma and attend my own soul and the souls of those folks I was in contact with, I saw Octavia Butler's work. She's an interdisciplinary scholar. She's a feminist philosopher of science and someone very much interested in tending the soul in the world through her writing. She also wrote about how psychology and what she was calling parapsychology, but in my estimation, she meant depth psychology, any psychology that posits that there is an unconscious or some part of us that is not just what you see and what persona and form we wear when we're with other people. That's just the underlying theme of depth psychology, but also that stories are rich, and those archetypes that are offered in stories are the things that really help us to function and grow and be with one another in the world. And so instead of becoming a therapist, which maybe my spouse would have liked more, I don't know, or a teacher, since my spouse is a dedicated teacher, I became this other thing, which is the founder of the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network, because it was impressed upon me. You okay? Yeah, be careful. It was impressed upon me to do something with the information that I gained in the ground, like an embedded journalist in the war zone where all this trauma was taking place. And I'm certainly not the only person doing this work. And I have a weird orientation to being a scholar. I happen to have a PhD. I knew that the collection was going to end up at the Huntington Library before the Huntington Library sent the press release. This is how her work, how she ushered me into this work right before she passed away. So when I'm doing the work of being the founder of Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network, it means that I get to do fun things like this, but I've also had major symposia at Princeton University, UC San Diego. I had the pleasure of co-convening a conference at the Huntington Library that was ongoing during the exhibition that Natalie Russell so delicately and lovingly put together. And if you don't know anything about the archives, it has more than 8,000 individual items and more than 250 boxes. So my other nerdy positive obsession claim to fame is that aside from Natalie, who had to look through the things as she was putting them together, I know more about what's in the archives than any other individual because I can drive there and look at it, and because I grew up in Pasadena, and because I am a young African-American woman from a working class background, and I can see things there that other people maybe cannot see because of my lived experience. And I feel that All Saints brings your lived experience and compassion and empathy to the work of being in community, and that was Octavia's mission. So now I would love to give you all the opportunity to ask me any follow-up questions about all of the things that I have said this morning, because I'd like to know, can you tell me by show of hands, who's heard of Octavia Butler before? Okay, who's read any of her books or short stories? Many people. Wonderful. So I think we can get into some interesting information that's beyond just the biography and beyond scholarship. I'm just an adjunct. I teach at Cal Poly Pomona, where I also got my undergraduate degree in theater. I teach African American studies for the Ethnic and Women's Studies department, which is in the department that teaches education and integrative studies. But I feel that I am so much more, and that this work is the work that helps me to be in conversation with people. There's this organization called the Free Black Women's Library, run by Olaronke Akinmowo, and she is in New York, but there's an LA branch that would love to come and do a pop-up library where people can exchange books by Black women and have some kinds of activities. Or there's Adrienne Marie Brown, who's doing work in emergent strategies. So there are lots of other people doing this work, and my work is to uplift them, but also to say it's not all shoot 'em up Star Wars. It's about the soul of the world and how we dream a future into being. Like, what would a world without prisons look like? What would a world without poverty look like? What if every single woman could give birth safely? And there's all of these huge questions that we can imagine through science fiction that we can't in any other genre. So I really would love some questions from you.
Hi, I'm Krystal Jones.
I'm just gonna grab some water.
Okay, thank you so much, Ayana, and thank you, All Saints, for having you here. I don't know if this is a question, Ayana, but it's just interesting to me how so artists are traditionally, or I think I embrace artists as canaries in the coal mine for what, being prophetic in terms of what is happening to our society. And although I understood the laughter, I found it a little bit problematic when the image of Trump, the kind of a referral to what's happening in our society now in terms of our president and how Octavia professed that, in her books.
You noticed it was Reagan who actually said, let's make America great again in the 1980s. And I was pretty young then, but many of you all remember that. So I think the laughter was discomfort and despair and wonder and a lot of things. But
whatever it is, yeah. I think it's just, it is for me, and it's about women's voices not being taken seriously, Black women's voices not being taken seriously, but also, it is traumatic and painful, and sometimes that's the way but all this to say, I read Kindred, that was my first introduction, and then Dawn and Adulthood Rights, and this whole dystopian, movement that we are experiencing in our literature and children's literature. I just found, I was like, wow, Octavia was doing this back in the late 70s, and so I just am grateful that the archives are there, but also the work of Clock Shop, and I didn't know about your work, so I'm glad to know about it.
Well, I failed to mention that I was a collaborator with Clock Shop. I wanted to show one of their videos, but I couldn't choose which one I wanted to show, but they did a lot of tremendous work bringing Octavia's work into the community and having events that people could go to that were outside of scholarship and not just readers. They actually had an exhibit, a first exhibit inspired by her work at the Armory for about a year, right before the exhibition opened. And yes, they do amazing work, and I neglected to mention their work because there's just so much. But yes, we should put a link to their work as well, most definitely.
So, back here and then up here.
Hello.
Go there, and then
Hi. Hi, I'm Kimberly Barry. I don't usually ask questions, so I don't know how to do this exactly, so help me out. So I had 3 questions based on something you said, 3 things, and you can address them as best you can. So the first one was, you said something about Octavia being a feminist philosopher or something. What was that?
Feminist philosopher of science.
That one, yeah. I'm curious about that, and maybe you could say more about what that is. And I'm also curious, like, how you see that intersecting with other aspects of her lived experience. And then the second question I have is, how do you live as an adjunct professor? Are you? Because I want to know. As people say right now, I'm in the process of reinventing myself, is what people say, but I'm just trying to find a new way to live in the world, and so I'm curious about other people's experiences. And then the third thing is, you said something about emerging strategies, and I didn't totally understand that, and I would love to hear more about that.
Sure. So I don't think all 3 of those questions are questions that maybe everyone needs to hear the response to, but I will shout out a couple of other places where you can find the information. So there's a professor at Pomona College. Her name is Amy Bong. She was one of our very brilliant and distinguished speakers at the Octavia Butler Studies Conference that took place at the Huntington Library. You can hear the audio of her talk, her paper, on the Huntington's conference recording websites. You can hear that audio. And if you contact me at via social media, you all can find me at OEB Legacy on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook, and on Instagram at oeb.legacy. And then I can send you a link. She also has published that as an article in another reader that I can't remember the name of. And there's also some other publications around feminist philosopher of science. You can also read Shelley Streeby's book called The Future of Climate Change. And she writes 2 very huge chapters about Octavia Butler and climate change as being someone who predicted and was writing about and alarmed about climate change before anybody else was trying to deny that it was real. So that's a really poignant book for that. The adjunct question, to be very honest, my spouse is a public school teacher who is tenured, and without his love and support, I could not do this work. And frankly, if it were not for him, I could not survive adjuncting. So that's just the honest truth. And the final question, Adrienne Marie Brown has a couple of books. The newest one that has just come out is called Pleasure Activism, and it's about how to survive the world and derive pleasure from the world when you are an activist, because you will get burnt out, heartbroken, and sick if all you do is deal with the genocide and apocalypse that is already happening in some folks' lives when you're attuned to that cultural wound. That's what she writes about. Her first book was co-edited by Walida Imarisha, and it's called Octavia's Brood, and it's got science, speculative fiction stories from social justice activists, including LeVar Burton and Mumia. So Mumia, who wrote a fan letter to Octavia Butler. So that's another work that you can look at. And there's a book called Emergent Strategy that's based on the emergent strategy that comes from Octavia Butler's work that Adrienne Marie Brown wrote. There's also an institute where people can learn how to facilitate things the way Adrienne does. So those are all places that you can go. Those links are on my website. And that's certainly a place that people can go to further pursue this line of inquiry, and also to find out more about other speculative fiction writers and other scholars that are doing accessible work for regular people who are activists and so on. Nobody else gets 3 questions because that's not fair. And if this were an academic conference, I would not have allowed that, but I'm being polite. So, yeah.
Hi, is this on?
Try again. Put your mouth
Hi.
There you go.
Okay, good. I'm Cheryl Walker. I'm really excited to have you here. And I'm going to just talk about two reasons that I'm excited to have you here, one of which is very personal and one of which is very communal. I belong to the Fiction Fund reading group here at All Saints, and we are doing Kindred in 2 months, and we welcome all of those that would like to join us and read Kindred and come. It's the July 26th meeting. The other one is that I've just finished a book. It's on African American writers and the new psychology, that is the psychology of the early 20th century. I didn't know that you had this double interest, but my question is, do you find Freud relevant to Octavia Butler? Because that's what I didn't write about Octavia Butler. I was writing about Harlem Renaissance writers, but that issue of the relevance of the new psychology to African American writing is what I worked on.
So, I would suggest that if you're curious about that, there are a couple of places you can look. There is a doctor by the name of Sharon D. Johnson who has written about depth psychology. There's several of us Black women depth psychologists who have written about just that. I'm actually a critical depth psychologist, in which I will just say it, and I hate to put this on the stream, but it's true. You cannot have any discipline or study that's based all on old dead white men. You will be in some big dang trouble if that's what you think your source of knowledge is, and so there are people doing the work. So Sharon D. Johnson wrote about the brother-sister complex between Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. She also edited a book called Seeing in the Dark that I would have loved to have been a part of, but my research schedule didn't coincide with it. But those folks have those questions. And so I don't want to give Freud any airtime because he's not my jam. But you can look to their work for a really salient critique on those issues.
So we have time for just one.
Can we let her ask a question?
Sorry, Clara, I didn't see you.
We have a couple minutes still if we're concise, but
okay.
I do.
All right, thank you. My name's Clara Hill Williams, and how can you touched on some things that resonated with me with respect to how All Saints as a community could look at what Octavia Butler has written with respect to community. Community is a big theme here that we're trying to really just come together with, along with the racial justice issues. Can you give us some pointers and tips from your study?
So I'm going to give you some quick and dirty tips about the way that community shows up in Octavia Butler's work. And Moya and I try to model this in our own organizational relationship. So Moya is a professor at Northeastern University, but she's the woman who coined the term misogynoir. Who knows what that is and what that means? Misogynoir. Yes, it's the particular ways that Black women are treated as, are hated and challenged and diminished in this society. So she coined that term that everyone uses. But she's the digital alchemist for Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network, and you see her work on Tumblr, and we have co-edited 2 journal volumes. One is a palimpsest special issue on Octavia Butler, and another double issue was commissioned by Women's Studies Journal right after the conference that we had at the Huntington. So if anyone would like to read those articles and see what the latest scholarship out of the archives is, that was the way. So what Moya and I tried to do is be non-hierarchical. Obviously, like I say I'm the founder, but when there's decisions to be made, I don't make any decisions by myself. Or let's say someone contacts Moya and says, oh, I want you to do this TED Ed thing. She's like, oh, I think you should do it. So we pass it along to the other person. So non-hierarchical behavior, because Octavia thought that humanities, or some characters in Octavia's work thought humanity's demise would be the conflict between intelligence and hierarchical thinking, and that we would one-up ourselves to death. So that's in the Lilith's Brood trilogy. But in Parable of the Sower, the video also mentioned Earthseed, which is this belief system that the character wrote down after she said that she was observing the things that happened around her, and she didn't invent the religion, but she articulated it as something that people should be alerted to. That is the blueprint for the ways her communities work. She also has communities that are made up of various parental configurations, communities raising children, taking people in, educating them and teaching them to read, feeding them, teaching them how to farm. There's a strong environmental justice and food justice aspect of her work. And those are some other ways. Being in service to the community, how can the people around you be allies? How can the community be stronger through being your whole self, right? And being in relationship with people. Those are a lot of the things that are expressed in her work, and that is what my work is. And I say that the greatest gift that Octavia has given to me is you all, and she brings us together. That's what my work does. Like, I get to be nerdy and have my positive obsession, and it's because of her that I get to do this work. And so that gratitude and showing up and trying to be open and transparent and honest about things like how much an adjunct doesn't make, and really be transparent and not just pretend to be something that I'm not. Those are the things that come out of her work. And I love that you all came. I'm grateful to you. It's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for having me. I think
can we say thank
after.
you to Dr. Jamieson?